Hello, everyone. It is another Tuesday in the summer, which means it's time for another deep dive into the employee hierarchy of needs. Today, again, Laura and I are together. We're going to be talking about the next level in the employee hierarchy of needs. Oops, this happens to me every time.
Giving like the preview.
Yes. So if you're a really fast reader, you've already had the whole presentation. So we are going to dive into the employee hierarchy of needs, which is a model that we use when we think about talent strategy and infrastructure in organizations. And in case this is your first time joining coLeague or learning about coLeague, what we do is coLeague brings people experts to mission-driven organizations, freeing up leaders to focus on the most mission-critical priorities. And we do this primarily in three ways. The first is we embed fractional people leaders in organizations on a part-time and interim basis. And that can be if someone's on leave, if an organization doesn't know yet what type of leader they want in that role. We often place people who help an organization prepare to have a full-time, long-term leader in the role. But we also do all sorts of different versions of that, putting embedded fractional people leaders in organizations. We also do quite a bit of consulting and support for organizations in everything from supporting teacher recruitment and other talent acquisition to coaching for leaders, to building special models and frameworks for organizations, whatever it is that leaders need. And then our most recent and most exciting service that we offer, I think, is coLeague On Call, which is a subscription on-demand HR talent support service. So that's not just getting your questions answered, but also getting a professional set of eyes on whatever it is that you need a professional set of eyes on, whether it's your employee handbook or a new policy, that sort of thing. And so when we talk about the employee hierarchy of needs, this is a framework that helps to really truly center your people in your talent strategy and infrastructure. And so when we're talking about it, this can be for any leader. It could be a senior organizational leader, like a CEO, executive director, COO. It can be for a talent leader. It can be for anyone who is thinking about how, as I'm setting up my talent strategy and infrastructure, how can I be sure that we're actually centering our people? And this model grew out of all of the work that we've done around answering that question: is how do we center our people? And an issue that leaders come to us often is we have a whole list of stuff that we want to implement. They come and they say, coLeague, we need help. We want performance. We want compensation. We want new job descriptions. We want all sorts of things. But asking the question, where do we start, is always difficult. And so when you use the employee hierarchy of needs, you ensure that your team's most basic needs are met first, so that everything that you build on top of it is a strong enough foundation that those initiatives will not fall flat. And the whole theory behind it, based on our research and our experience, is that if you put in sophisticated, complex talent initiatives, but you're missing some of the basics, those things will not only probably not work, but it might actually backfire and cause more problems than it is solutions. So we want to prevent burnout. We want to prevent turnover. We don't want a toxic work environment, but doing things in the wrong order could have unintended consequences that are exactly those things. So the employee hierarchy of needs has 5 levels. And at the bottom, we have a foundation of safety, where employees feel physically and psychologically safe and are confident that their employment is legal and secure. We have purpose, which means employees know what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how their work connects to the bigger picture. Structure, which we're going to talk about today, is that there are transparent talent systems and structures in place that support employee needs and goals. And then our last 2, which we'll cover over the next few weeks in the rest of our series, are autonomy. So employees can effectively and independently pursue their goals and know what type of future is possible for them. And then lastly, incentive. Incentive here is about the future, less about a bonus or a specific incentive, but rather what can motivate your employees to think about the future. And in here, employees know what's next for them and how they can get the support and resources they need to get there. So a lot of times when I was talking about putting things in the wrong order, if we accidentally put something like a career pathways model in place, but employees don't feel psychologically safe, it almost doesn't matter what you do at the top of the pyramid if the things at the bottom are not in place. So 2 sessions ago, we talked about safety, and on the basic idea there is that psychological safety is often treated like a luxury, something that we think about once all our systems and processes and things are in place, but rather in using the employee hierarchy of needs, it says that safety is first. And a good foundation of safety, and that's physical safety, psychological safety, and the security of knowing and understanding that your employment is legal. The way organizations can really succeed with this is moving beyond interpersonal psychological safety, which is, person to person or maybe manager to team, and think about what structures can bolster psychological safety in our organization that don't require every single individual being always on top of their game. And if somebody has a bad day, you don't want that to then threaten individuals' psychological safety. So then last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked about purpose. And in the mission-driven organizations that we work with, everybody has a big mission. And sometimes that feels like enough, but sometimes that mission is so big that any individual employee might feel like, this isn't even worth doing. How is this spreadsheet that I'm working on today gonna, give every child in this country access to good nutrition? It just isn't. It's difficult to make that connection. So employees need to be able to say with clarity, I know what my job is. I know why I'm doing my job. I know how to do my job. And I know I'm working on the right things, so that an individual person can think about, well, what's my purpose right now? How is this connected to the big picture, everything that we're doing, instead of trying to connect a small detail to a really, really big mission. And then today, we're talking about structure. And structure is a really significant breaking point here, because purpose and safety are these non-negotiables. We have to have those in place first. And structure is when we start thinking more concretely about the systems and processes, both that we have now and that we want to have in the future. And you'll see this phrase over and over again, frameworks first. So we're thinking about, are we implementing a system, or are we first implementing a framework? Meaning it's sort of like, what's the strategy for the model? What's the strategy for the thing that we're building, so that when it's time to expand it, we have a solid foundation. And we all know that when we're building a house, we start with blueprints. Obviously, we have plans. And I think organizations are very good at this part, right? What is it we need? What is it that we need? How are we going to do it? What's the plan? But we know we can't just make a plan and then there's a house, right? And if we look at the blueprint and just picked up a random page, we might think oh, we should work on this roof. I mean, the roof is a super important part of the house. But this is a really obvious metaphor, but if there's no walls, for instance, roof is now a floor. And so we have to think about what comes in between having the idea, knowing what we want to build, and actually having a house, a building, a structure that works. And so we think about that frame. What are the things that go up first in order to be able to do the rest of the house? And if we only built all the individual pieces, or we want to have a really great garage, but we forgot to connect it to the house, then you're oh no, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. So instead, we want to think about what systems and structures can we put in place, even if they're very simple, that mean we can build on top of them and not have to go back and replace the whole thing when we want to do something more complex. And so we use this example a lot because it's a really common example that we hear from employees. Employee turnover, we hear things like, well, I'm leaving because I don't know how to get promoted. And so it's a pretty reasonable reaction to hear something like that and think that what they need is career pathways. Oh, we need to know what comes after this type of job or this type of job. But we might need to dig a little deeper to listen to the employee to understand okay, they don't know how to get promoted, but why do they want to get promoted? Well, it often turns out there's some sort of whole list of other things that are going on, right? We get to, they haven't had a review. Maybe they feel undercompensated for their job. Maybe they don't even have a clear job description. And there's just a million things. And then there's social things like resentment, frustration with your peers. They could have personal things going on in their life. They could be stressed out about money. There's all these things to unpack. And if you just build a career pathway without unpacking and making sure those other needs are met first, then it's going to be a nice document that you've made, but it's not actually going to solve the turnover problem. And so what we're talking about with structure is going even deeper by thinking of like, okay, well, let's pick one of these things and do it, right? Well, we know we need good performance management to understand how people are doing so that we can decide whether or not they're going to promote them. But if you try to make a performance model without digging, again, one layer lower, and you need perhaps a job leveling model. Hopefully Laura and I will talk about this bit, but like I like to think about, your job in relation to the organization, right? Am I managing work? Am I managing people? Am I leading teams? That kind of thing. You might need competencies so that everyone is being assessed on the same basic, either competencies or values for your organization. Is there a model for feedback? Do people know how to give feedback? Have managers ever been trained in how to do a review? Do people have goals? Like all these questions that if left unanswered and you just put a performance thing in place where, well, we know that on this day they're going to do their self-review and on this day they're going to do their manager review. Well, that's all well and good, but if there's all these other things bubbling under the surface that don't exist, it's going to be almost like an act of theater in that review rather than something that's meaningful and actually can contribute to that underlying or the overarching question of like, how do I get promoted? So the big idea that Laura and I are going to now talk about that hopefully we'll get to dig really deep into is in order to create a sustainable talent strategy and infrastructure that you don't have to keep redoing over and over again, which is something that we see a lot, and that will give your employees a lot of change fatigue, is to plan for the future, but start small. So whatever we build first needs to be the basis for those future systems so that you can your employees can anticipate the types of things that might be next. They understand that we have this system, we're going to build the next one on top of it. And it just really saves you a lot of trouble in the future by focusing on frameworks first. So now I'm going to pass the mic to Laura, who is going to hopefully ask some good questions and think about how we can start with frameworks first.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. I do think, it's interesting when you said we hear from a lot of organizations, things like promotions, right? Because I do think that's sometimes the easier thing for staff members to say. And I also think that has a little bit to do with what you were talking about before around safety and purpose. So maybe start with what happens when you're starting to bring in structure before trust and clarity and safety exist.
That's a really, really good question and good step back point because in our original introduction of the employee hierarchy of needs, we talked about how most people think that structure comes first, right? We have to be organized. We have to make sure we have all these T's crossed and I's dotted, and that's definitely true and important. But if you have a really intense review process where there's lots of steps and it's going to feed into this and that, and now we know who's going to work on what, et cetera, but your team doesn't have a good job description, they're going to feel like, am I a crazy person? Like, you want me to assess how I'm doing against what, right? And that can lead to resentment and frustration. If you've declared that you have pay equity at your organization, but you haven't determined and answered questions like, do we pay more for education if somebody has a master's degree or a PhD? Do we, how do we handle pay equity at promotion time, right? If you're being promoted into a team, but there's a new compensation model now, and those sort of things can really cause a lot of employee anxiety. And anxiety is really the culprit in a lot of organizational challenges, right? Where people feel unsafe, they feel insecure, they feel like they don't know what's going to happen to them. And when people are anxious, they act out. Just true, like of all of us. And as I've said in every presentation we've done about the employee hierarchy of needs, the world is anxiety reducing enough. So anything that we're doing to create anxiety in our employees is really doing a disservice to the organizational mission. It's doing a disservice to your employee well-being. It's doing a disservice to important things in tough times like retention.
Yeah.
And something that we talked about when we talked about purpose 2 weeks ago was also in a tough market where it's not a job seekers market and people feel disengaged, they might still stay.
Yeah.
And if you have people staying who don't have trust in the organization, who feel very anxious, that can become toxic very fast. So trying to put structures in place without trust, without psychological safety, without a deep connection both to the mission and to the larger work starts to feel like make work or theater, as I referred to it earlier. It doesn't feel like an authentic next step in building the structure of the organization.
Yeah, and we'll get into this in a little bit of like how do you start to go at building structure, but I also imagine if people don't feel like they trust this process, they're also not going to share their feedback about what they actually need and to your point before, like what are the most basic needs that they have around structure that you can build from, which is actually where I wanted to go next. So it does seem very overwhelming. Like I'm thinking about your slide of like, here's all the things that might be affecting employee attrition. And then let's even dig in deeper into performance management. Here's all these things to think about. It can feel really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, how do you start and what do you mean by start small?
Yeah. So let's pick performance is such a useful one because it is so complex and employees want it, managers want it, you especially want it. It comes up the most when we're like, we think this employee is not performing and we feel like we need to do something about it. And they're like, oh, we should have performance management. But instead there's, we haven't been giving this employee feedback this entire time. They have no idea how they're doing. We don't have all these various things in place. And so you take something as big and complex as performance. I like to break it down into its component parts. And you can start at the complex place. Be like, okay, if I'm going to do a really good review of my direct report, what are the components? Like what information would I need? What needs to have already happened before today in order to make that an effective experience for the manager and the direct report so that there's clarity about next steps. They have a really strong sense of how they're doing, what's next for them, et cetera. So the performance stuff that I'm talking about there is even higher on the pyramid beyond structure. We're getting into autonomy and incentive, right? But if we're trying to have an employee understand how they're doing, well, there's the check boxes that we might have already gone through in safety and purpose, right? Do they have a good job description? Is there a clear mission? Do they actually know what they're working on and why? That kind of thing. And then if I'm going to have a really good conversation, review, I needed to have given them feedback in the past. Okay. That's a big one. If I had a whiteboard, I would be like feedback and circle it really big. We would need to have a really strong job description so that we can reference this is how you did and what you did. And this is what you were expected to do and how you were expected to do it. We want there to be something on which to assess them that is the same for everyone across the organization. So it's not just each individual is getting their own special custom review. And so that's when you hope that there are things like either core competencies or organizational values that you can assess against. Core competencies might be things like communication, respect, inclusion. Those are the types of things that are basic and should have the same expectations for everyone. And that's how the employee can feel that they're being assessed fairly, not just as an individual based on the whims of this manager, but rather the expectations of the organization. To have a really good review, there needs to be evidence of what has been achieved or not achieved, right? So we needed to make sure there was any kind of work documentation at all, right? So if you jump in to do a review and then all you've got is your memories, maybe you have some notes from one-on-ones, hopefully you had one-on-ones throughout the time, then you're going to be really hit really fast with a bunch of cognitive biases that we don't have time to dig into today, but things like the recency bias. If you haven't been keeping great notes and giving feedback on a regular basis, whatever happened most recently is probably going to have the biggest impact on that review. And that can be very frustrating for someone who performed really well for 4 months, and in month 5 or something happened, right? And then maybe there was a conflict or they missed a deadline, and suddenly the review is focused on that. And they're like, but what about all these other things that I did that were so great? And we already talked about that thing in the moment. Like, why is my review focused on this? So when you have all these other pieces of evidence from one-on-ones, from previous feedback, et cetera, you've created a pretty straightforward process of, this is what you did, this is how it went, this is whether or not it met expectations. So breaking that down into all the component parts of what a good review would be like. And then, so if that's here, all the components building up to it, then you can get really good and think about what comes after that. Well, what do we do when somebody's had a great review 3 times in a row? Is there an automatic promotion? Does there need to be a role for them to be promoted into? So that's where you get even more complex. So when you get to workforce planning, much higher in a different part of how we think about talent strategy and infrastructure, when you have a larger organization, you want that performance model to already be in place, so that when you're doing succession planning and workforce planning, you already know how people are doing. Oh, we know that this person has great potential to lead this department. And so we've been investing in them this whole time. And now that it's time for growth, we've already identified a great candidate. Wow. But if you try to do succession planning when you don't have a great performance model in place, and you didn't have a good performance model in place because you didn't have a good feedback model, then suddenly you're facing a really big organizational change and you're like, oh no. And you're looking at the blueprint instead of the frame, right? You're like, okay, well, what systems do I need to design now? And then you're doing massive, rapid change in the organization, which we know can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences as well. Does that make sense about how you think of the future? What would I need for that to succeed? And then work until you get to its simplest component parts.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I will say it still feels very overwhelming, or maybe even more overwhelming, to get into that level of detail. And I think just building off of the last thing that you said about, like, if you do like a whole bunch of change at once, you could end up with a bigger mess than when you started. I feel like when I've done this not well is either because I tried to do all of it in a small amount of time, or I knew it was going to take longer, but I just wasn't transparent with people on how this was a building block to these other pieces.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is that what you've seen too?
Yeah. And that's why, like, if I go back to this slide here, well, just kidding. I don't remember where the slide was. Sorry, can you ask the question again? I got distracted by my own slide adventure.
Yeah, like, I'm just thinking about, like, it's even feels more overwhelming when you start to get into all of those details.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then I was thinking about when I've done this wrong. And the first way is because I tried to do all the changes at once quickly, and that created a lot of confusion. The other time was when I was very methodical about it, but I wasn't sharing what was in my brain about how this is a building block for this. And so people didn't know where it was going.
Right. Okay. So that's exactly what it was. There's a reason that says there are transparent talent systems and structures in place that support employee needs and goals. And there's a lot of employee education that has to happen in order for the average employee whose job is to think about finance, right? Or is to think about volunteer recruitment. They have a job that isn't talent strategy and infrastructure. And so we don't want them to have to know all of those things already and expect them to just understand how companies work. So there is a little bit of education involved, and that's part of change management as well. But if you have an organizational leader or a talent leader who's able to say, this is our roadmap, and we know that what we eventually want is this beautiful house. Here's what that house might look like. We want your input on what that house looks like. And we have a basic blueprint, but in order to get to the part where you can decorate the walls, right, and do the landscaping and install beautiful lamps, we have to make sure these other things are in place. And so here are the things we're going to do first, so that they also aren't anxious, wondering, well, if we only have feedback model, am I ever going to get feedback from anyone other than my manager? Like, all of these questions can be answered by simply having a roadmap. And that's something that we specialize in at coLeague, is thinking through what is it you're actually trying to achieve, How do we work backwards from there? And we actually have a product, the Talent Diagnostic, that can do a pretty quick and effective survey of how your employees are interacting with your talent strategy and infrastructure to get a clear picture of if there's any gaps in that foundation. So not only is it a problem if it's too fast, but also if it's too vague, right? We're doing feedback now because feedback is important. Or we're going to do, values, like great, wonderful, but then what's next? Or if we're only going to do core competencies, or we have these competencies, but these people who do fundraising have a whole different skill set than the people who do operations. So like, how are we going to assess those people against each other? If they can see on the roadmap that those things will come, but we need to hit a size of the organization, more complexity of the organization. Right now, we're all hands on deck. So we're building the basic stuff that we know everybody needs to have a good employment experience. And once we reach a critical mass of being able to move to the next step, then we can bring in the electrician and the plumber, right? And then we can put the rest of the walls up, and then we can do all those other things. So I think, again, I say it 20 times a day, like it's all about preventing employee anxiety. Employee anxiety breeds all sorts of other discontent.
Yep. Sticking with this idea for a little bit, I am curious from your perspective, what is important from staff perspective? So certainly transparency, communication, we've just been talking about some of that. Yep. Are there other things that matter as you're building out structures in your organization that you should be keeping in mind for your staff?
I might actually, if I had the deck with me, which I don't, refer to the SCARF model that we talked about when we talked about psychological safety. And so that is things that impact employees. The S is status. So like, I know where I stand like in this organization. I know sort of like what I can and can't make a decision about, that kind of thing. Certainty, like I know how things are generally going to go. I have some idea about the future. A is autonomy. In this case, I have a say in how things go for me. The R is relatedness. So if status is about where I fit in the hierarchy, relatedness is an in-group, out-group kind of stuff. And then fairness is, I will double click on fairness and say that humans as a species care a lot about fairness. And so if people, an example I would give is, no matter how good your other stuff is, if people don't feel fairly compensated, either compared to their peers or compared to their work or compared to maybe what they might earn somewhere else, all bets are off, right? Because then that's all they're thinking about. And so they might figure out, how can I do less work? How can I get a promotion to get a job title that matches the work that I'm doing? How can I get more money? All of these things become the focus instead of how can I more effectively do my job? And I think that like fairness is probably the thing I hear about most. And sometimes it's fairness about workload. And sometimes fairness of workload is not the perception is incorrect, because I've had to do a step back with a lot of teams about the concept of accountability. Like what you're individually responsible for may seem like a lot of tasks, but compared to this other person who's accountable for the work of 10 people, it may look like they have fewer tasks, but they are individually accountable for all those other people. And so transparency about how your hierarchy works, transparency about your management structure, transparency about decision-making authority, like those types of things can really make employees feel like they understand the stuff. And maybe I'm so biased because understanding helps me feel better about a lot of things, and I do recognize that bias. But I have found, working with teams of various sizes and across organizations, is that folks want to understand the model, and then they can make a reasonable choice about their future. And instead of just feeling like there's an injustice, they're like, okay, well, this model is this way because. So they care about fairness. They care about certainty. Like they don't want to think that they don't know what's going to happen to them. They care about all of those things in the SCARF model. But I would say focusing on ones that are related to the most triggering, which I think are fairness and certainty, are your best bet.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Okay, final question for you. Someone's listening today, they're like, I think we're pretty good on safety and purpose. I think we are squarely in this structure bucket. What's the first thing you would suggest they do, or even like smaller, what's something they could do this week?
I think is to jump ahead. What would it look like if it was great? What are all the things you would want to be true? And dream big. Like if you were suddenly, you're a 20-person organization, you're suddenly a 150-person organization, what would people expect of you? And then write that down on a whiteboard and be like, okay, well, what's reasonable? Like, what's the next step down? And then make your way back. And I promise you're going to land somewhere like job descriptions, job leveling, some of the stuff that's in that, in those earlier levels of the pyramid. I wouldn't try to build from the ground up. I would start big. What does great look like? Talk to someone at coLeague, talk to someone who really deeply understands great talent strategy and infrastructure, and then look at the resources that you have. Is that money? Is it time? Is it people? And figure out how you can allocate resources against building those most basic things first. So start big, work your way back. And once you get a list of the basics, then you can work with someone like coLeague to implement that as well.
Love it. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Of course.
I feel like we talk about this all the time, and each one of these conversations, I get so much more insight. So thanks for doing these, Sarah.
Thank you, Laura. All right. Everybody have a great rest of your week and rest of your summer, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.